London, May 19, 1536. A grey, heavy sky dawned over the ancient stones of the Tower of London, casting the fortress iron a dull, colourless light. The morning chill clung to the walls, curling into every corner like an omen. Below, in the inner courtyard, something grim awaited. During the night, by the flicker of torches, labourers had quietly assembled a scaffold of pale, freshly cut wood. It wasn't like the grand, raised platforms used for traitors or common criminals in front of cheering crowds. This one was lower, humble, almost intimate, as if England itself was ashamed of what was about to happen. It wasn't just the shape of the scaffold that drew attention, but what stood beside it. A long, gleaming sword. Not the broad, brutal, English axe favoured for executions, but a sharp foreign blade. Along with it had come its master, an executioner brought all the way from Calais, renowned for his skill with the sword. The English axe was known for messy, brutal deaths. The sword, by contrast, promised something quicker, more merciful. A strange courtesy for a woman so recently declared a traitor. By early morning, the whispers had begun. The first trickle of spectators gathered at the gates, their breaths missing in the cold air. Servants, merchants, noblemen in embroidered cloaks, London's curious and its cruel, all drawn here by the same shocking reason. Today, they murmured, a queen will be executed. The first in England's history. Anne Boleyn, the queen who had overturned a kingdom, torn a king from his wife, broken with the mighty Church of Rome, and helped forge a new English church with herself at its centre. Now the woman who once wore the crown with such dazzling confidence would meet her end on the very ground that had once celebrated her triumph. Inside the tower, behind damp stone walls, Anne stirred from uneasy sleep. She had spent the last 17 days imprisoned here, waiting for the inevitable, time stretching and folding in on itself day by day. But now, at last, the waiting was over. Today was not just another day. Today was the day. She was 35, not old by any measure, but the years of court, the burden of scandal, betrayal, and political warfare had aged her in ways unseen. Still, the elegance remained. The sharp, knowing eyes, the regal posture, the air of a woman who once made kings forget reason. The few ladies-in-waiting who had stayed with her, those who still clung to loyalty amid the court's poisonous whispers, moved gently around her, helping her prepare. Every piece of clothing is chosen with careful thought, as if for a final performance. Over her slender figure they draped a mantle of deep grey, lined with fur to keep away the morning chill. Beneath that, crimson, a bodice of rich, dark red silk, the colour of rubies, the colour of blood. Practically, yes, the stains would not show, but also dignified. A queen's death should not be messy. Then, with the calm of someone almost amused by her own fate, Anne broke the silence. I hear the executioner is very good. I have a little neck. With delicate fingers, she traced the smooth curve of her throat, a gesture both light-hearted and chilling. Witnesses would later recall the remark, spoken with a half-smile, as the most haunting thing they had ever heard. Not panic, not tears, but humour. Dark and sharp, like the blade that awaited her. It was as though Anne Boleyn, even now, refused to let the court have the satisfaction of her fear. The queen would die on her own terms. Before we get to the sword-swinging climax, if Anne Boleyn could plan her last outfit for maximum impact, you can plan to click that subscribe button and ring the bell, because heads may roll, but great content shouldn't. How did Anne Boleyn come to this terrible end? Anne Boleyn was not born into scandal or tragedy, at least not at first. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat with sharp elbows at court, and Elizabeth Howard from one of England's noblest families. Ambition, charm, and sharp intelligence flowed in her blood. As a young girl, Anne was sent abroad to be educated in the finest courts of Europe, first in the Netherlands, then in the glittering cultured circles of Renaissance France. There, she absorbed the art, literature, and sophisticated courtly manners that would one day set her apart in the English court. By the time she returned to England around 1522, Anne was no naive court maiden. She wasn't the kind of delicate, pale-skinned beauty celebrated in paintings or poetry. Her olive complexion, jet-black hair, and sharp dark eyes made her stand out in a world that prized golden-haired, fair-skinned women. But Anne's real power was never in her looks. It was in her mind. She was witty, fluent in French, skilled at music, poetry, and dance. She could disarm with a glance, command with a word, and most dangerously of all, she could say no. And that's exactly what she did when Henry VIII, restless, impulsive, and trapped in a loveless marriage to Catherine of Aragon, set his sights on her. Anne knew exactly how the game worked. She had seen her own sister, Mary Boleyn, used and discarded as the king's mistress, but Anne was not going to be another royal pastime. When Henry offered her a position in his bed, Anne offered him something else entirely. "I will not be your concubine," she told the king. "If you want my heart and body, you must give me a crown." It was audacious, reckless even. But Anne was betting not just on Henry's lust, but on his pride, his obsession with producing a male heir, and his growing frustration with Rome's interference in his affairs. And Anne was right. From 1526 to 1533, Henry VIII pursued her with a passion that bordered on madness. His love letters to Anne, full of desperate longing, still survive, stained with time. For this woman, the King of England turned his back on the greatest power of the Christian world, the Catholic Church. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, the king declared war, not with armies, but with ink and law. Henry tore England away from Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, excommunicated himself, enraged the Pope, and made enemies of Catholic monarchs like Emperor Charles V. All of it, every political upheaval, every schism, was driven by the king's desire to have Anne Boleyn by his side as queen. In January 1533, they secretly married. Anne was already pregnant, and Henry was certain God had rewarded his struggle with the son he so desperately wanted. In September, Anne gave birth at Greenwich Palace to a daughter, Elizabeth. It was not the triumph Henry had imagined, but Anne remained queen, and for a time all was well. Brilliant, educated, and fiercely opinionated, she promoted religious reform, sponsored humanist scholars, and encouraged the circulation of English translations of the Bible. To her supporters, Anne was a radiant modern queen, a champion of progress, but at court, danger gathered like thunderclouds. To her enemies, she was nothing but a cunning heretic, a seductress, a witch who had cursed the king's marriage and the kingdom itself. Anne's enemies waited for her to stumble. And then, she did. The queen's greatest strength, her ability to give the king a male heir, became her fatal weakness. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne suffered a miscarriage in 1534. Then, in January 1536, she lost another child, a male fetus, shortly after the death of Catherine of Aragon. For Henry, these tragedies were not just personal ones, they were political failures. What good was a new wife, a new church, a broken kingdom, if it could not produce a living son? By now, the king's eye had begun to wander again. Jane Seymour, demure and fair, waited in the wings, and Anne's enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, the king's powerful advisor, began to plot her downfall. Rumors of flirtation became accusations of adultery, then charges of incest with her brother George Boleyn, and finally treason against the king himself. It was a storm of lies, carefully arranged by powerful men who wanted Anne gone, and Henry, in his bitter disappointment, was ready to believe them. Less than 3 years after she became queen, Anne was dragged from her chambers to stand trial before a court eager for her blood. And now, on this cold May morning, she awaited the sharp sword of a foreign executioner. The woman for whom kings had broken kingdoms was about to lose her head. As Henry's love cooled, Anne's enemies gained strength, especially Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. In April 1536, the conspiracy to overthrow Anne gathered momentum. Cromwell orchestrated an investigation into the Queen's supposed improper conduct. On May 2nd, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The accusations were as grave as they were absurd: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, conspiracy against the king's life, and treason. Her trial on May 15th was a legal farce. Without the right to an attorney or to confront witnesses, the Queen was subjected to a tribunal composed almost entirely of political enemies. Despite this, Anne defended herself with eloquence. A witness described how she answered everything so wisely and discreetly that she seemed not a woman but an angel. It didn't matter. The verdict had been determined before the trial even began. Guilty, with a sentence of death by burning, the traditional punishment for female treason, showing a final flash of mercy. Or perhaps merely concerned with international public opinion, Henry commuted the sentence to beheading and ordered that a specialist be brought from France. The French executioner was an expert in the use of the sword, promising a swift and relatively painless death. Back to May 19th, 1536. At 8 in the morning, Anne received news that her execution had been postponed until noon, a cruel blow, as she had already prepared herself psychologically for the end. The additional hours were spent in prayer. Witnesses report that she took communion and during prayer stopped several times to say, "Lord, have mercy on me." At one point, she swore upon the sacred host that she had never betrayed the king, saying, "For my salvation I am free of the things for which I was condemned." At noon, the drums began to sound. Anne bid farewell to her ladies, giving each a small gift as a memento: a prayer book, a handkerchief, a piece of jewelry. "Remember me and how I end," she asked them before being led to the scaffold. To say, crowd that gathered to witness the execution was smaller than expected, about 1,000 people. There was a strange, almost respectful atmosphere. Most of those present removed their hats when Anne appeared, dressed in grey and crimson, walking with the dignity that had always characterized her. On the scaffold, Anne was granted permission to make a final speech. Her words were carefully chosen. "Good Christians, I come here to die according to the law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." These words reveal an extraordinary woman, even facing an unjust death. Anne did not proclaim her innocence nor attack her enemies. It was a masterful political move. By presenting herself as a loyal subject to the end, she preserved the dignity of the crown and indirectly protected the future of her daughter Elizabeth. After her speech, Anne removed her mantle and cap, handing them to her ladies. One of her last gestures was to give a purse of gold coins to the executioner, payment for a job well done. She then knelt on the scaffold, but noticed there was no block to rest her head on, as in executions, with an axe. Beheadings with a sword required the condemned to remain kneeling upright. One of her ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes. Anne continued to move her lips in prayer. "Jesus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The executioner, following French tradition, employed a merciful trick to distract Anne. "Where is my sword?" he asked aloud. though he had already silently positioned the weapon. When Anne turned her head slightly toward the voice, the executioner delivered the blow with brutal precision. The blade cut through the slender neck, separating the head. From the body in a single motion, there was a momentary silence, followed by a collective sigh from the crowd. The executioner picked up the head by the hair and raised it, proclaiming, "So perish the king's enemies." But there was no customary roar of approval. Instead, only an uneasy murmur travelled through those present. At that moment, the thunder of cannon resounded through the tower, echoing across the Thames River. It was the signal for Henry VIII, who was waiting at his Whitehall palace, that he was free to marry again. The next day, he became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. 10 days later, they were married. Anne's body was collected by her ladies. A brutal peculiarity: no proper coffin had been provided for the former queen. Improvising, the guards found an empty arrow chest, where Anne's body, with the head placed beside the trunk, was carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower itself. There, under the stone floor, without tombstone or marking, Anne was hastily buried in an anonymous grave. Henry VIII ordered that all portraits of Anne be destroyed, her emblems removed from palaces, and her name struck from official records. This damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was so effective that to this day there exists no authenticated contemporary portrait of Anne Boleyn. But if Henry intended to completely erase Anne's influence, he failed spectacularly. 23 years after her execution, her daughter Elizabeth ascended to the English throne. Elizabeth I would rule England for 45 years, in a reign considered a golden age. The daughter surpassed the father in almost every aspect, and her greatest legacy was the stability that Henry had so sought. In 1876, during a restoration of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, bones were discovered in the place where Anne was believed to have been buried. Among them, a female skeleton with delicate bone structure and a small skull was identified as likely being Anne's. These remains were reburied with more dignity. Today, the site of Anne's execution is marked by a simple glass slab on the tower of London's lawn. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, roses are laid there by admirers. To many, Anne Boleyn represents not just a tragic figure, but a symbol of historical injustice and the price that powerful women frequently paid. And in the final twist, the woman who lost her head subscribes for more true tales drenched in drama, power, and poetic justice.